Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you to our Seeds of Change conference. This is the first session of 5 we're going to be having over the course of this week. And today we are thinking about debt and finance, and this intriguing title of Government Deficits, QE Forever, and whether we found this magic money tree or not. My name is Jonathan Tame. I'm the director of the Jubilee Centre, and I'm just having a quick look here to see where people are coming from, which is fantastic. Let me just see. I can spot Callum, who is checking in from Kenya. That's wonderful. Callum used to work for us. I can see others like Reinhardt, who I think may be coming from Egypt, and Rod, I think, is also from far away. I'm just kind of guessing here because, of course, it doesn't actually say in the Cyprus. Reinhardt's correcting me. If you want to use the chat function right now, just to say hello to everyone and let people just see where you're calling in from, that would give a sense. Because unfortunately, with a Zoom webinar, as this is, we can't see each other. But through the chat, we can at least get a little bit of a sense of who people are and where they're coming from. Do make sure if you put something in the chat that it's going to all the, you need to say to everyone, so not just the panelists, but to everyone. So that's fantastic. So brilliant. So welcome to all of you. Yes, do introduce yourselves on the chat there. So what we're going to do is, as we go through the event, I'd really encourage you to put your any thoughts or questions you have particularly into the Q&A. You should have at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button, and if you click that, you can put your question in. If you don't have a particular question, then feel free to just look through the other ones, and then you can click to vote up that question if you like it, and that way we will get a sense of which questions are ones that are shared by several different people. So a couple more points. So the Seeds of Change conference is hosted by the Jubilee Centre. As probably most of you know, we're a think tank based in Cambridge, and we provide Christian perspectives on today's social, political, and economic issues, and try and help Christians and followers of Jesus to be salt and light where they are and around some of the particular pressing issues of the day. And obviously this one of debt is certainly like that. So also just in the background, my colleague Mercedes will be available in the chat if you've got any other kind of technical questions. She'll be able to respond to those. But now I'm just going to introduce our moderator who will be leading us through the rest of the day. It's Nathan Mladin, who is senior researcher at Theos, which is a think tank that does a brilliant job of convening a national conversation around religion and society. Nathan has a PhD in theology from Queen's University in Belfast and is a visiting lecturer at St. Mellitus College in London as well. His research and speaking and writing focus on the ethics of technology, on political economy and theology of culture. And I've just been delighted to look this morning at his latest publication through Theos called Breaking Ground, the Church and Cultural Renewal. And I'd really highly recommend that to everyone really on the conference. So I think that's all I need to say. So I'll hand over to you, Nathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you to Jubilee Centre for inviting me, and indeed for hosting what is now the second year of this amazing conference, this week-long series of events looking at really important topics coming out of the pandemic, hopefully. And it's my pleasure to kick us off with this first session this week, looking at government deficits, quantitative QE forever, and the magic money tree. I must say, all of you who have showed up are extremely keen to the point of geekiness about debt, and specifically government debt, our kind of main topic for this evening, or perhaps you just care deeply about the real impact of debt on individuals, households, and indeed human relationships more generally, and understand how those two actually interact in important ways. And perhaps you do both. You're just a bit geekish about these things, and you also care deeply. Either way, or if you're somewhere in between, you are more than welcome this evening. Our aim tonight is to not simply be another talking shop, just another event, but since Jonathan mentioned the report Breaking Ground, where one of the key metaphors is that of kind of farming and agriculture, I would hope that tonight is, in a sense, a greenhouse, where we identify the seeds and nurture the seedlings that will yield the most fruit in positive change that will see more and more people flourish in this nation. So we'll try to do this by hosting what we hope will be an expanding conversation, a conversation that puts us in touch with the rocky and uneven economic landscape in our COVID times. Feels like post-COVID is almost too optimistic, although again, we can hope. And more importantly than just putting us in touch with the reality as it is, it would give us, to go back to the metaphor, the seeds and the seedlings that we can plant wherever we find ourselves in our work and our vocations, in whichever institutional or other kinds of settings that we are embedded, to see the positive change that gets us closer to a flourishing society. So I don't want to take too much of your time. I know our first speaker, who is delivering the main presentation, has a lot of information, a lot of insight packed. So I will simply introduce him and present to you the format for this evening. So we're having Dr. Paul Mills present to us on the topic announced. Paul has worked at the Jubilee Center prior to his doctorate at Cambridge University. He then worked at the UK Treasury and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, until 2016, with specialties in government debt management and financial stability. And he's currently an elder at the Baptist Church in London. And he's also a member of the Cambridge Papers editorial board, which, if you haven't checked out yet, you should. So Paul is more than qualified to give us this presentation and to engage us about the salient issues around how how the government funds itself, and what are the practical implications for people on the ground. And that's why the format is Paul will speak for roughly 20 minutes on the topic, and then we will hear from Hannah Brown from the Joint Public Issues team, who has been working on the Reset the Debt campaign. And also we will hear from Helen Webb of Christians Against Poverty. I will introduce them when they come to speak, but I just want to mention they will be partly responding and partly grounding, in a sense, the conversation based on their own experience and practical initiatives coming through from their organizations. After their responses and presentations, we will then discuss among ourselves for roughly 15 minutes, and then opens up to questions from you, the audience. As Jonathan mentioned, make sure you put your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom and not in the chat. And we will aim to finish promptly at 5:30, so you can enjoy some dinner tonight. But without further ado, I will hand over to Paul to walk us through the promises and perils of government debt and their implications.
So I'm going to talk very briefly about this huge topic, deficits by government, quantitative easing, or QE, and what's called the magic money tree. That's sometimes just called money printing, but it's also got there's a new acronym, MMT, that's modern monetary theory. And then very briefly going to touch on some of the new innovations that the Bank of England and the Treasury, portrayed there on the slide, are thinking about They're called central bank digital currencies. Can I have the next slide, please? We're on the, in a sense, cusp of monetary history. I'll explain terms, recent developments, just briefly touch on monetary theory and central bank digital currencies, then the biblical concerns with some of these developments, and then how we sort of make our response concrete in terms of both policies that governments should pursue and actions that individuals can. Next slide. That's going to come through, thanks. I just want to stress that various developments during the lockdown and then also have been in train for the last decade are placing us on the cusp of sort of momentous changes in global finance, in monetary systems, and so on. So just in the short term, we've seen a big pickup in inflation relative to the recent past. That's partly because of lockdowns and the restoration of demand after that and opening up economies. But it's likely that we are moving to a transition to higher inflation rates, but low growth. And so therefore, strongly negative real interest rates. That means the interest rate is going to be perhaps 1%, but inflation is going to be, for many years, 3, 4, 5%. And so it's going to be a negative return in real terms. We're also seeing deglobalization that's started with concerns over the role of China in the global economy. And then if tensions with Taiwan build, that's going to lead to further separation of economies across the globe. And we're also seeing a big debate going on between what our monetary system is going to be, perhaps in the next decade going forward. Is it going to be focused around central bank digital currencies, or are cryptocurrencies going to be the payment systems going forward? So those are just a flavor of the big things that are happening in the background. If we go to the next slide, thanks. Very briefly, terms, government deficit, when I say that, that's traditionally the difference between the government spending in any calendar year or financial year versus its tax receipts in cash. Now, of course, for most of the past 2 decades, governments have generally been in deficit. That means they've spent more than they've taken in cash, but that is just the tip of the government balance sheet. So governments own a lot of assets and owe a lot of money, particularly in pensions. And so the deficit is the small part of the bigger picture. Quantitative easing is the economist term for effectively the central bank buying assets and creating money, base money in the process. Central banks generally buy government bonds, but they can also buy mortgage-backed securities, and in Japan, they also buy equities. MMT is modern monetary theory. This is the idea that effectively governments, because they can create fiat money, should not be constrained by the idea of the budget constraint, that any taxes or borrowing that governments do is essentially to destroy money that they have created through their spending. Central bank digital currencies are what central banks are currently working on in terms of creating effectively electronic cash. Everyone would have access to a bank account at the central bank and be able to transact through that account just as they can with bank deposits. And then cryptocurrencies, there are multiple cryptocurrencies being developed. These are effectively on what's called a blockchain technology. They act as electronic payments mechanisms and electronic assets. Next slide, please. For recent developments, very briefly, we've had the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Then we had record peacetime deficits as economies rapidly shut down due to banks being in trouble. But those deficits were financed by central banks making large purchases, effectively of government bonds, to keep interest rates down. So in the UK, we had £375 billion of purchases, largely of government bonds, some corporate bonds by the Bank of England. In the following decade, deficits gradually declined, but QE expanded or stayed the same in most of advanced countries. In the UK, QE went up by 70 billion over that decade. Interest rates were effectively at zero for a decade. They edged up a bit towards the end, but still well below 1%. And then in the past 2 years, we've had lockdowns as a result of the pandemic. That induced massive deficits for government as effectively spending shot up to stimulate economies, taxes collapsed, health spending rose rapidly, and effectively all those deficits were financed by purchases of government bonds by central banks. So in the UK, we had QE of 450 billion, so the stock of gilts and other assets owned by the Bank of England effectively doubled. Interest rates again went to zero. What's effectively gone on over this period is that low interest rates have not really generated inflation as they're theoretically meant to do. What they inflation in terms of retail prices, they've inflated asset prices. So they've kept houses and equities and bonds at very high prices. There has effectively been no deleveraging after the debt crisis of 2008. Of late, debts have been shifted from the household sector to the government, but total debts in the economy have not gone down and have built up. One point I'm going to make as an economist, lockdowns are not a good idea. This was a terrible policy mistake. It was never costed out. After we knew what the data was after 3 weeks, it should not have been persisted with. We would never have tried it if we were on a different monetary system. So if we'd been on a gold standard or Bretton Woods, this would not have been possible. Without QE, it wouldn't have been possible. The Treasury could not have afforded a deficit of this scale without the Bank of England buying the bonds. So we've only gone down this route because we've had the option of QE. Next slide, please. So this is just depicting what happened with the UK deficit. This is similar to what's happened in other countries. If anything, US borrowing has been even greater relative to the size of the economy. So we saw a big spike in the deficit. So this is the Office of Budget Responsibilities charts from the budget in November a few weeks ago. So effectively the blue lines, the dark blue line is where they're forecasting government deficits and borrowing to go. And as you saw in 2020-21, the government deficit went over 300 billion. That was financed on the right-hand chart by a big pickup in bonds owned by the Bank of England. So this is the total of QE assets owned by the Bank of England, reaching almost 900 billion. Bank of England now says that if interest rates, if its policy rate gets to 1%, it will start allowing the gilt it holds to fall away and mature off. The policy rate may get to 1%, and this may happen, but these predictions of QE being unwound have not been fulfilled in the past, and I have my doubts whether it'll happen on the timetable they put out. Next slide, please. So in the immediate prospects, as I said, we're going to have low productivity growth. Governments have got very budgets have got very high and large during this process, but we're going to have higher inflation as governments decide on moves towards net zero. They're going to effectively move to very expensive energy sources, which are going to be unreliable, and that's going to lead to sort of higher prices being built in to goods and services. Interest rates may edge up, but real rates are going to stay negative for a long time because central banks need to erode the real value of the bonds that governments have issued. So their debts have got to be brought down in real terms. So just to expect for perhaps the next decade, inflation at the sort of 3 to 5% level, interest rates perhaps maybe at 1%. Next slide, please. So one of the responses to this has been the greater popularity of something called modern monetary theory, or MMT. Ironically, that's also called the magic money tree, same acronym. The idea that effectively governments need not worry about the debts they're building up because they can print the money. The author most associated with this idea now is Stephanie Kelton, and she published a book a couple of years ago called The Deficit Myth, essentially saying governments should not worry about their degree of borrowing because they can print money, and therefore they can access resources to any degree they like because they can print money to do so. It is very similar to quantitative easing. It's a sort of cousin of what's been going on without this sort of need to buy assets in government bonds in the secondary market. It can just, modern monetary theory foresees the government just printing money via the central bank to access resources. I won't go through all the details of this, just to say that particularly in the US, it's influencing Federal Reserve policy. The Federal Reserve recently changed its objective to emphasize much more its goal of full employment. And essentially, the Fed is committing itself not to raise interest rates until full employment is achieved. And the current US administration have been pushing extreme fiscal stimulus at the moment to try and reduce unemployment, and the Fed have been accommodating that and continuing to buy US bonds in the process. Just to note that if this idea gains more and more traction, it means that we're into a completely different monetary regime than the sort of remnants of the Bretton Woods system we've had. The Bretton Woods system tied the dollar to gold, and other currencies were linked to that. We then went through a process of thinking that government deficits mattered. And then if this theory becomes more and more popular amongst policymakers, it's essentially saying the fiat currency system, the ability of governments to print money, sort of will be with few bounds. The only constraint is, do you want to contain inflation? Next slide, please. But then in the background, a number of central banks in the world developing the idea of them creating a digital currency that effectively means that every citizen would have access to a bank account at the central bank. It's a delayed reaction to the financial crisis, but also the rise of cryptocurrencies that may be alternative payments mechanisms. The key thing to note is that one of the policy tools around such digital currencies is that the money would be what is called programmable. That means that it could, the policymaker, the central bank, could change the rules of the game. At the moment, it cannot do that with cash, for instance. Once a note is issued, it's out in circulation, it's got to validate the face value of the cash. That's not the case with central bank digital currencies. You'll be able to impose negative interest rates. You'll be able to tax money in different ways. You can incentivize purchases. You'll be able to say your money only exists for 3 months. You've got to spend it now. So in that sense, it's a perfect tool for policymakers wanting to nudge or incentivize the population to do what they think is right. It is not blockchain technology. It's not like a cryptocurrency where that's a decentralized data ledger. This is a very centralized data ledger. It's effectively Web 2.0 rather than Web 3.0 if you want to go into the jargon. There are potential advantages of this. It means that it's very clear that the state is backing the money that is issued by the central bank. There may be advantages in financial access to banking services, and it might mean that there are lower transaction fees. The real problems with it are that it, however, means that there could well be a big increase in state power in terms of surveillance, in terms of taking over the deposit base from private banks, and in terms of controlling what the populace spends money on. The problem with it is that once this gets going and politicians want to use this as a policy tool, you'd have to repress other monetary systems to do so. You'd have to ban not just crypto, as China has done, but you'd have to start stopping the use of gold, Amazon gift cards, you name it, anything else that might be used as a competing money to avoid the surveillance and or the nudges of central government. So moving on to the next slide. How as Christians might we address some of these issues? Obviously, some of these are very technical issues. What does the Bible say? Well, first of all, just to note that it needs to be set in the framework that the Bible sees a definite role for government. Central government is there to restrain evil. But on the other hand, central government can be repressive. And so its powers need to be restrained to stop tyranny. So that comes through in Deuteronomy 17, the powers of the king in Israel, but also Revelation 13 is a counterweight to Romans 13. Central government can be both a benign force for good in restraint of evil, but also a tyrannous form. In terms of money, the Old Testament does not prescribe any form of money. It doesn't say metals must be money, but it does speak of prices in terms of silver and sort of assumes the use of silver as money. Debt is regarded as servitude and is cancelled within Israel every 7 years. So debt itself could not become money if it was being cancelled. It wouldn't be a store of value. It could only be a very short-term monetary means. We have to be concerned from what we call a stewardship perspective of governments racking up large quantities of debt in the current generation that's then passed on to the future. The problem is that high government debts are associated with slower productivity growth within a society for various reasons, and it gives the temptation to allow inflation to get rid of the real value of debt. So one of the problems with high debts within a society and an economy is that they act as a drag, act as a burden, and then bring about the temptation to allow inflation or to debase the coinage or whatever. Inflation is effectively theft. It's restructuring, it's defaulting on a loan. And so you've either got a problem of high debt burdens or inflation being the two problems of excessive debt within a society. There's been a problem with quantitative easing and low interest rates, and it's kept interest rates very low. That has made those with assets extremely wealthy. So as you know, the richest in the world economy have grown incredibly richer relative to even those in the top 10% or the top 5% of the wealth bracket. So this process of the last 10 years has made wealth inequality explode and expand. That's contrary to the Jubilee principle that we at the Jubilee Center of the past and now have sort of been promoting from the Old Testament, this idea of widespread distribution of assets and wealth being an important element of the biblical economy. And then we see in Revelation 13 just a warning that state abuse of the transaction power can lead to the persecution, not just of the church, but anyone who disagrees with it. So there is in the back of our minds this vision from Revelation 13 that the state can abuse its power over economic transactions to introduce tyrannous persecution. Final slide. So what do we do about all these things? They seem huge geopolitical developments, things that the Treasury and the Bank of England are cooking up together. What might we do? So in terms of policies, we can think about how to restrain excessive government debt is to truly account for government on a proper basis. Government does not apply to itself the accounting processes that it requires companies to do, particularly for pensions. So the government, UK government currently is running on a 4 or 5 trillion pound pensions deficit. If it was a company, its directors would be immediately imprisoned. But because we don't think about that and don't publicize that, we don't do anything about that. That means that there's this big intergenerational injustice going on in the budget, government budget. And we should think about having much more of an intergenerational budget constraint. The Welsh government, for instance, has a policy where impact of any government policy has to, on future generations, has to be assessed before it can pass. We should think about deleveraging the economy. That means trying to move households, companies, governments off debt and towards equity or alternative means of finance, so that we don't need inflation shocks to get rid of the debt. I think we need to campaign against central bank digital currencies because of the danger of the repression and surveillance they entail, which China is implementing at the moment through its digital currency. If we go down this road, we must argue for privacy and what we call non-programmability. That means politicians should not be able to tax money just on a whim. Just on a personal basis, we need to prepare for higher inflation than in past decades. I'm not talking about stagflation or, talking about hyperinflation. I'm talking about just structurally higher inflation, 5, maybe 10% inflation. Try and get your head around whether crypto payments mechanisms are the alternative way to go. For instance, that may be a way to get missions payments into hard to finance countries where banking systems don't work. But I think particularly to pray for wisdom for policymakers, particularly Christians in politics, because these issues are incredibly weighty and technical. So pray for Christian MPs in the UK that you know this will be a difficult challenge going forward. Thank you.
Yes, as expected, that was very rich in figures and stats. And some of them seem quite out of reach, but if we look close enough, in fact, the policy, the monetary policy that the government adopts has real implications for people on the ground, as we say. So now I would like to turn to Hannah Brown from the Joint Public Issues team, just to say a few words about Hannah. As I mentioned earlier, she She is the Campaigns and the Church Engagement Officer for the Joint Public Issues team. And she looks at their campaigning, ensures that they are run effectively, and they are especially keen to empower local churches to engage with questions of social justice and effective change making. And she has helped to run the Reset the Debt campaign, which has called for debt write-off for COVID-19 related household debts in the UK. And she has a particular interest in the theology of debt, how we communicate about debt, and also, of course, grassroots campaigning for political change around debt, problem debt, that is. So I would like to hand over to Hannah Brown to perhaps kind of ground Paul's very meaty and stats-filled kind of presentation, to present things from a different angle, from the real struggles of households who have been affected by the pandemic, but who have also benefited from this deficit spending that Paul has so helpfully unpacked for us. So I wonder if Hannah would like to give her presentation in roughly 10 minutes, and we'll go from there. Over to you, Hannah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Paul. It's really good to be here to talk about the other end of the spectrum in terms of debt, the impacts of debt on households, particularly on some of the poorest income households in our communities, and particularly how this changed during COVID. It feels like a bit of a jolt to come to a household view after Paul's presentation, because the systems do work really very differently. But I think it's important that we remember the qualities of both of these experiences of debt when we talk about finance and debt. Because if we aren't grounding our understanding of these issues and the lived experiences of people, particularly low-income communities within our society, as we talk about our financial systems, then we're inevitably going to veer away from an economic system that serves the poorest in our society and therefore ultimately serves each one of us. So like Nathan said, I'm here to talk a little bit about a campaign that I've been working on called Reset the Debt. I work for a group called the Joint Public Issues team, and we bring together the Methodist Church, the Baptist Union of Great Britain, and the United Reformed Church in partnership with the Church of Scotland to work together on issues of peace and justice. And together with an organisation called Church Action on Poverty, we conducted some grassroots research during COVID-19 to hear a little bit about what issues were within communities across the country at the time of the lockdowns. We knew that it was frontline local groups who were going to be best placed to hear about and understand the pressures that were on families in this very unique time. And we found that whilst at the forefront, people had those everyday issues going on, those issues of do we have enough to eat? Can we afford a meal for this evening? Do we have somewhere to stay for everybody in our communities and who are coming to our services? That the issue lingering at the back of a lot of people's minds and growing larger and larger was debt. We found that many people who were just about managing to stay afloat before COVID were being forced into borrowing simply to make ends meet. Gradually, this grew and grew, and by April of this year, 11 million people were estimated to have had to borrow to make ends meet since March 2020. And within this, 5.6 million people were still struggling to afford the everyday essentials. This borrowing was building up in multiple ways. The kind of debt we've heard most commonly about in the media and from government is rent arrears. So rent arrears built up because of COVID, where people have lost income and have fallen behind on rent payments. But there's also been a build-up of debt around utility bills, around council tax, credit card payments, and even borrowing from friends and family. It's estimated that in total, the collective amount of all of this debt has built up to over £25 billion worth of debt and arrears. And as a consequence of this move to borrowing to make ends meet for a lot of low-income families, 2.87 million more people have become at risk of long-term debt problems because of COVID. And the number of people in severe problem debt has doubled since the start of the pandemic. And for us as churches, perhaps what made this issue more acute was that we were hearing locally that it was the poorest families in our communities who were being hit first and being hit hardest by rising debt. And as time went on, this was backed up by statistics. Around 19.2 million adults experienced a loss of income as a result of the initial lockdown and the subsequent lockdowns. However, this loss of income wasn't evenly distributed across society. Within the first 2 months of the March 2020 lockdown, for the poorest fifth of households in the UK, median earnings fell by 15%, or roughly about £160 per month. And by May 2020, around a quarter of the lowest paid workers in our society had been placed on furlough. However, in that same time period, only 6% of the top fifth of earners had been furloughed. For many people, furlough represented a 20% drop in income where the job support scheme wasn't topped up by their employer. And this drop in income, even a small one, creates a huge amount of pressure when a budget sheet is tightly balanced by a household, especially when at the same time many were experiencing a steep rise in living costs. Budgets that were tightly balanced pre-COVID were stretched by the inability to shop around to make the most of discounts, or by the added expense of having children at home rather than at school. For people who were just about coping with no leeway in their budget, these changes tipped them over the edge. And we found that single parent families, UK minority ethnic communities, young people and disabled people were all more likely to have fallen behind on rent and bills because of COVID-19. The pattern generally goes, if you are more likely to be at risk of poverty before COVID-19, you are more likely to build up debt as a result of the subsequent lockdowns. This buildup of debt was presenting an issue of inequality, where the most vulnerable were bearing a greater burden for the financial shock of COVID. People like Leonie, who we spoke to in August 2020. Before COVID, Leonie was doing shift work through an agency, which she'd been doing for years. But when she was laid off because of COVID, she fell behind on her rent, her council tax, and her water bills. And now, as I'm sure that our next speaker, Helen, and our friends at Christians Against Poverty will tell you, debt is a bit like a tsunami. You feel the buildup of pressure long before the full impact of the tidal wave hits you. There's often a delay before the crash hits families, and debt repayment becomes an immediate and urgent problem. As a group of churches and Christian organisations, we felt that it was essential for the government to intervene in this moment, to step in this in-between. As the pressure was building up, action was needed now to ensure that vulnerable families wouldn't feel that full impact of COVID debt that they were forced to take on simply to make ends meet. And the government offered some support in this time, some support that was paid for by the borrowing that we've heard about, such as the pause on evictions, the furlough scheme, or the £20 per week uplift to universal credit. And whilst these were really welcome interventions to help keep families afloat at this time, they simply delayed this problem of debt that pushed these consequences further down the road. This was the case for people like Andre, who was seeking support for debt before COVID through a church-based debt centre. When Andre's work as an Uber driver dried up during lockdown, he lost control of his repayments, and that threw his life out of balance. He ended up having to put plans for a family on hold with his partner, for example. We felt that we were at risk of emerging from the pandemic with the burden of debt weighing down on the poorest families in our communities, holding them back from moving forward. So in autumn 2020, we partnered with other organisations like the Jubilee Centre to call on the government to reset the debt. Since then, we've been asking for the UK government to set up a Jubilee Fund to write off unpayable COVID-related debts, to shift the burden of this unpredictable debt away from vulnerable families and onto the government. Original estimates suggested that this fund would need to be about £5 billion to cover the majority of unpayable COVID-related debts. For us as churches, this campaign was built on the biblical principle of Jubilee, which we find in the Old Testament. The Jubilee principle was part of a debt system which included write-off as a crucial part of ensuring that no one was trapped in poverty because of debt. It took the view that debt should not be used as an exploitative tool. It should never come at the cost of the well-being of individuals and families who are set within a wider community. And for us today, this was a key principle for how we should be responding to COVID-related debt. Since we began calling for this action, it's been really interesting to see how the landscape has shifted. In Wales, there have been calls for a debt bonfire, with politicians suggesting that the government should buy up some of the debt of poorer families. In Scotland, we've seen £10 million of grant funding made available to support tenants who've fallen into arrears. And finally, in England, in October, the UK government announced a £65 million support package to be distributed by local councils to low-income earners who are behind on their rent. I think I've got to wrap up quite quickly, but just to point towards the future. Still, most of these contributions towards those who are in debt are really a drop in the ocean. The Debt Charity Step Change estimate that COVID rent arrears alone amount to over 360 million. We think that a COVID reset of the debt is one part of a long-term solution to looking at debt, and we recognise that it is not the whole problem the whole answer to problem debt. There's reform needed of the wider debt repayment system, which crucially organisations like Christians Against Poverty are working closely on to ensure that we have a fair debt repayment system for those who are found stuck in this challenge. But ultimately, COVID debt is something that was forced on low-income families through no fault of their own. It's been forced on small businesses or lenders, such as small landlords, who were lent responsibly and now are holding the burden of this debt. And it's important that government shares the burden of this debt with these low-income families to enable them to move forward. As we move further and further away from COVID, it's harder to justify this debt as something in isolation. It's having kind of ricochet effects on other aspects of families' lives. But we're seeking to find ways to continue talking about COVID-related debt and responding to it as a key part of how we build back from COVID. And the churches will be continuing to advocate for that in the future too.
Thank you, Hannah. And actually, apologies for putting pressure on you. That was completely unintentional. I actually started my camera by mistake because I thought you were actually coming to a fairly abrupt close. So thank you for carrying on and giving us some really important insights and also kind of practical initiatives. Some of them are ongoing and some of them are coming into the future. So thanks again. Remaining at this level of kind of analysis, looking at the impact of the pandemic, but obviously people have been struggling in debt well before the pandemic and the government's responses. CAP have been faithfully working with people in debt and poverty for a long time, in a quite an innovative approach and in strict partnership with local churches. So I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, Helen Webb, which I mentioned earlier. She is the National External Partnerships Manager at Christians Against Poverty. And she has been working for CAP at CAP since 2008. Originally training as a debt counselor. And she then moved on to new client inquiries team and joined the external affairs team. And she was in many ways responsible for building relationships with the Department of Work and Pensions and the negotiation of the National Partnership Agreement. She works to develop national and regional referral relationships and to promote the work of CAP. So I wonder, Helen, if you would like to perhaps respond to Paul, but also please tell us how things look like from your vantage point and from the vantage point of CAP and CAP's important work with churches for those most affected by debt problems. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thank you so much to Hannah and Paul. Really, really interesting. I am really enjoying listening to your presentation. So I'm probably going to take this down to yet another layer. I am going to sort of talk quite a lot of stats too, but I'm hoping that Mercedes will really kindly pop a link to our client report into the chat at some point, so that if you want to go off and look and dig down into the stats and read the report, that you'll be able to do that. So I'll just start from the beginning and say we're really delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So really, I'm going to talk about our clients, their lives and their debt, and the trends and the changes in household debt that we're seeing. So every year at CAP, we publish the annual client report that I've mentioned, and that is created from a survey that's sent directly out to the clients to complete, and also data from our debt counselling system. And our client report we launched earlier this year, it was launched at the end of April, and the clients completing the surveys were doing that during COVID, so between October and December 2020. So please go, if you can't follow the link, just go to the main CAP website to look at a copy of this. Obviously, don't do it now. I'll just talk through the figures with you now. If you go to the Connect and the policy and government menus on the website, the client report is called Our Story. And alongside all the stats and things I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon, you can actually read 4 client stories, lives really transformed by, getting debt free and working with CAP to do that. So here at CAP, we actually spent the whole of 2020 waiting for something to happen, kind of waiting for that wave of people in debt that everyone had been talking about for so long, like with COVID in full blast, millions on furlough, redundancies rising, but it didn't happen. In fact, we saw less people coming forward for debt advice in 2020, and it seemed that people in debt were distracted by all that was going on around them. They were homeschooling, they were working from home, they were trying to juggle life and work, avoiding the virus, obviously in the middle of all that. Enforcement agent visits had stopped, universal credit payments had increased by £20 a week, and some types of debts, like council tax debt, were not being chased during the worst of the pandemic. So people weren't really focused on their debt so much. And also, as well as that, referral agencies who'd normally be working with key groups of our clients had to shift the way that they were able to help people during the pandemic. So agencies were providing more emergency support, focusing on food provision and immediate client needs. And those agencies who traditionally been seeing people face to face or at home weren't actually doing that. So ironically, all this, and probably lots of more reasons beside, were contributing factors basically to the debt advice sector as a whole, getting less referrals and seeing less clients than average during COVID. At CAP, we used all sorts of things to try and overcome it, including working with one of our national referral partners to engage with them and to develop new referral pathways. That was so we could really help to find the people that needed our debt help. We knew there were people still struggling with debt. We just needed to find them. So, the good news is that client numbers have increased kind of month on month, and we're back to normal levels of client bookings now and have been for a while. But the bottom line here is we don't think that we've actually seen the impact of COVID on referrals into the debt advice sector yet. And even recently, we haven't seen what we're expecting to see. Furlough ended, increased unemployment, and basically people seeking debt help en masse. It just hasn't happened. So I'm going to dig down into a little bit of that for us and paint a picture for you, really. So what about the clients that we were seeing alongside, like during the COVID period, and the types of debts that they were dealing with? So our average CAP client is, I'll just talk through. Our client demographics show that our biggest age group are 40 to 61-year-olds, and 46% of our clients are in that age bracket. And they're followed by the 26 to 40-year-olds at 36% of our total clients. Now, really interestingly, we have a large number of single clients, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that might be in a minute. But 83% of our clients are single or lone parents. So only 17% of our clients are in relationships. In terms of the property types they're living in, 7 in 10 of the clients are renting their property they live in, and only 12% are owner occupiers. Social Security is the sole income for half of our clients. So we're dealing with really kind of low income clients here. So with 85% of our clients will receive some form of Social Security. So roughly we could say our average CAP clients, it's around sort of middle-aged, 40 to 61, single, renting, and likely to be receiving Social Security for all or part of their income. So if that's what our clients look like, what income levels and types of debt are they dealing with? Our clients have really low incomes. 84% have an income lower than the national average, and 50% live below the poverty line. We looked back at our clients' income over the past 5 years and kind of compared the national average income with the CAP client average income. The national average income during that time has increased by around £5,000 since around 2015, whereas the CAP client income rate hasn't. But if the CAP client average income had grown at least at the rate of inflation, our clients would have been earning £592 more per year today than they currently do. So our clients' incomes are really very static and not rising. In terms of their debt levels, it's really staggering that on average, the clients owe around 139% of their annual income after housing costs in their debt. So, whenever I talk about this, I just kind of think about that. Just think about that for a minute. Think about your salary. Think about owing that level of debt. It's kind of quite scary, isn't it? It's a lot of money. So the type of debt that our clients have been dealing with has been slowly changing over, for several years. And this year it's no different. Our clients are owing increasingly more to their priority creditors. So in simple terms, priority creditors or debts are those really essential bills that we all need to pay to keep ourselves in our homes. So they're things like rent, council tax, gas, electric, and water. Interestingly, in 2020, 37% of our clients sought help with council tax debt. Now, that was actually down around 10% on the previous year. But if we look at that, this could be because of the fact that councils were not chasing council tax debt. There was no enforcement agent activity during the main COVID and lockdown periods. And perhaps that lack of pressure meant that people didn't seek debt help, or a lack of referrals from those council tax collection sources meant we didn't have so many clients seeking help with this type of debt. But we really do expect this figure to rise again next year. In 2020, 30% of our clients sought help with water arrears, 19% with energy arrears, and 10% sought help with rent arrears. So in contrast, the level of secondary debts are very slowly decreasing. And those kind of debts are things like the loans and the credit cards and the catalogue debts. From our perspective, it's always really interesting to see what clients cite as the main cause for their debt. And over the past 5 years, the top reason clients have cited for the cause of the debt is low income. And this is very sadly closely followed by mental health and relationship breakdown. The impact of dealing with this level of debt on people's lives is really shocking. Our clients tell us they are frightened of opening their post, answering the phone, and opening their front doors, all because they're worried and stressed about the content of those letters, the demands for payment of debts over the phone, and they're also worried, obviously, about enforcement agents being at their front door. Some clients were not even able to afford the basics of life. 37% of our clients were sacrificing meals, and sadly, we just hear so many stories from our clients about the fact they had to sacrifice meals before getting debt help. Others were going without heating. They had to make choices about whether to turn their lights on. And one client mentioned that she took the bulbs out of her lights, that she didn't use the electricity. And she also said her central heating was broken if anyone came round, so that she didn't have to put it on. And debt also has an impact on clients' personal lives. Worrying about debt impacted relationships. And this could be one of the reasons why we have so many single clients who are seeking debt counselling. It meant they couldn't sleep because they were stressed and worried about debt. They were isolated and lonely because they didn't have any money to socialise or to go out with friends or to see their family, and they didn't want to leave the house. All of this impacted their mental health. And 1 in 3 clients said they didn't have a meaningful conversation in a week, and half of them were lonely. So one of the more shocking stats I'm going to share with you today is that 28% of our clients considered or attempted suicide before working with CAP. In conjunction with this, it's the reality actually that people wait to seek debt help. I think this is really important. So half our clients waited over a year to seek debt help, and a quarter waited over 3 years. Now, the reasons they wait are because they thought they could sort things out from themselves. So they were trying to juggle their finances. They were fearful, they were ashamed and embarrassed, and they didn't know where to go to seek debt help. So we may have a bit of an answer as to why people are not seeking debt help so much at the moment. Perhaps they're waiting to see if they can resolve the situation, but perhaps they're embarrassed and ashamed and fearful, and they don't know where to go to get debt help. This makes working in partnership really key, and encouraging people to talk about money really important. So from where we're sitting here at CAP, we're watching prices rise. We've already mentioned that, especially of essential services like energy and fuel. And this can only get worse. So Ofgem are talking already about the cost of wholesale energy and the fact the price cap, which protects those on standard variable tariffs really from paying too much on their energy, will need to rise again next April. We're all seeing our cost of living rise. Since the beginning of October, everyone on Universal Credit now receives £20 a week less. The result of this is that we are seeing more clients with deficit budgets. So they just don't have enough money to live on. We can't balance their budgets. And the danger is that we get them debt-free via an insolvency option, but then perhaps expect them to come back again in the future because there's no change in their situation. They just can't afford to live. So we're not sure where all this is heading. But as you've heard, our clients have got static incomes, the cost of living is rising, and it's really not certain where everything's going to end. But what we do know here at CAP is that we can't help people without the local church who partner with us and open and run CAP services, and who have amazing hearts for people and can really minister and support those who need that support in their communities. We can't provide CAP services without people's generosity in giving financially to our work. And what we do know is there is considerable need. It's so great to be involved in this conversation today and like seeing the response to the church. And obviously, if you want to know more about the work of CAP, please take a look at the website at capuk.org, and please, get in touch or keep in touch. Thank you.